Chapter 5, he entitles it, Can They Do It? And it will look at this quote, what the levelers wanted, equality, accountability, and responsibility, are also what voters want today. And so essentially he's saying that this part of this end of globalization and part of the end of what we're seeing today is a response for voters wanting something better. And again, as a finance person, as a finance professor, he puts this in the context of business that us in business can understand really well. He talks about this idea of political entrepreneurs. That there's this idea of a whole startup industry now in politics. It would be interesting for us as business people to see how we could capitalize on this political entrepreneurship. I'm sure some of you, after reading this chapter, are probably wondering that. Like, oh, I wonder what's the profit angle here? We're not interested in politics necessarily right now in our lives, but what's the angle in business? But anyways, I thought it was clever. That was this idea of putting this context of what's going on during the transition phase between globalization and this multipolar world in terms of entrepreneurial activity. And because there are major issues, and he brings them up here, that people are reacting against. And this is the other thing that I think it ties us. I always want us to keep tying this book, which is essentially, as I keep saying, is a political economy book. I want us to keep tying it back into international business and business in general. And to think about that, if people are reacting to the system, and if people are finding it wanting, if you will, then yes, there are political answers. But remember, we're talking about political economy, and so there's business answers to this too. And so how are you going to address this in the context of a person in business, either locally or internationally? And some of the issues that he just sort of highlights some of the issues that people are looking at, things like mental health, and as an area that is certainly both, it's really interesting. Mental health is an interesting area where I think society is looking, because both I think we've never had mental health issues in society like we do now. We've structured our society in perhaps a incredibly mentally unhealthy way, and that's part of it. Also, as we've solved a lot of the physical health problems, and now that some of those problems are solved, we can turn our attention to the real issues of mental health and health in general. People are looking at the quality of health that's available in the world technically, and then saying, well, what about the access to that? And I think there's a substantive response to that. I think he doesn't know that in the book, right? But I think the COVID-19 is a really interesting example. I think if we studied the statistics around how health is structured and delivered to people, and infection and death rates and all of those kinds of things, I think we find some really interesting things. You may want to do that as part of a project in this course. You could look at that as an issue. Cybersecurity, people in technology and people's relationship to technology. And of course, all of this, and it's all sort of, and particularly globalization, right? And we saw it as part of the globalization debate, is climate change. Climate change is this massive sort of umbrella over everything we're doing now, that essentially there is a larger and growing group of people that say that the environment is no longer a simple externality that companies can say, well, it's an externality, so there's nothing we can do about it. So too bad your lake's destroyed, but I mean, we may profit. And growing group of stakeholders in society are saying, no way to us in business that we can extract profit from activities that are leading to climate change. And this is the idea, well, we're in business, it's not our responsibility. Perhaps we say, we're in business, this is not our responsibility. But I think what this book brings up is that society can say to us, well, you no longer get to be in business then, right? We're going to fundamentally change your models. We're going to fundamentally change how you can conduct trade, where you could put aspects of production. And there are people sort of engaged in these startups, if you will, to try to affect this change and what it's going to look like. So he sort of brings up this different parties, and this is really interesting. Let's just kind of go through them very, very quickly here, because he does this really interesting. He names parties sort of after historical either events or people or structures. So he goes through these sort of startup parties, if you will, that he's seeing throughout the world. And what's really interesting that he's showing is that not only are these parties entrepreneurial, but he sees that many times as pan country, right? So that they're multinational, if you will. And he sees this growing. He sees that there could be a movement towards more multinational parties. We've never seen that before, in a sense, not in a formal way. Their movements have been international, but that there are actually international parties that would support each other is quite interesting in this sort of multipolar world. And I think by doing this, essentially what he's trying to do is to say these are some of the kind of political ideas, and most of them focused in a sense on economics and business, if you will, that are sort of coming. And he gives them, say, all sort of clever names that he sort of roots in history. Like we know about the Leveler Party and this Heimat Party. He's borrowed this word from German, kind of a return to tradition. And the Digger Party, the sort of the Green Party that we can certainly the Green movement as a movement has become quite international. It'll be interesting to see as sort of a political entity how that unfolds. The Pilgrim Party, what's the role of religion and the returning to religion, either in a very sort of conservative way, which I think we may find easier to associate perhaps in sort of the Christian right in the United States, or maybe more fundamental approaches to the Islamic faith. But also we are seeing a movement on even the Christian left towards this idea of spirituality, even in connecting some of these others together. So that's interesting, right? And how do we respond to that as business people? The Governance Party, looking at structures of governance and the idea of orderly, fair rule of law, and on sort of the libertarian perspective, this Atlas Party, and then and his sort of, it's interesting to bookend these because we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the Leviathan Party, which is an interesting sort of reach into Thomas Hobbes, this idea of giving up liberty for the sake of security. And he gets a lot more into that. And certainly when that becomes the model, the Leviathan model, if you will, that changes a lot for how we do business and what business's relationship to the state is going to be. And is now in countries that sort of take this approach. We'll deal with that in just a few chapters. We'll come back to this idea of the levelers versus the Leviathan, which I think he sets up as the main juxtaposition in this book. So in chapter 6, what he does here is he has this sort of historically rooted, but I guess sort of, if you will, fictionalized, based on a real person, minister, this Catherine Chidley, and he's dilemma is what he has here. And he bases it around this idea of Yes Minister. If you've never seen Yes Minister, it sort of dates me that I've watched this, but it's really cool. Look it up on the YouTube. You'll appreciate at least some of the episodes of this Yes Minister that he's referring to in the book, where these bureaucrats, Mandarin, if you will, are taking the ministers for a ride. The minister for a ride in terms of their policy options. It's kind of an interesting. It was an interesting episode in or an interesting show in England some years back. But essentially, he's setting this minister up, this Catherine Chidley, as a person who is faced with these sort of real issues, sort of this real politic, and how would this fictional minister react to these issues in today's society? And what we could take from this is is the government going to react to businesses and to the work that we do? So one idea is that she could go down the path that so many before have gone before her and focus on these sort of quick fixes. And I think this is really interesting for us as we see our society in transitions. I think we're seeing it right now. Some of these things that are in the book are being played again right now because it's the same kind of play that gets made over and over and over again. This focus on shovel-ready infrastructure. Who's got a shovel-ready infrastructure project we can give you money for to stimulate the economy because that might help. We could simply say, okay, well, this is not our fault. We could blame someone else. We could blame China, if you will, or blame other countries for our situation. And then hopefully by that placate anxiety, or at least, I don't know, placating anxiety, but at least move it somewhere else. And the next thing that we see, and I'm probably going to see more of this perhaps over the next year or so as we transition, is an increase in protectionism. And you did review all of the slides, or the lecture on government intervention in the economy and all the sort of ways that government engages in protectionism. And I think we'll see governments start to bring out those tools. So during the transition time, as people of international business, we better absolutely know that protectionism is a common and normal response by governments during times of crisis like this. And so this will bring substantive disruptiveness to our value chains. And so those of you who are in international business or in supply chain, or anyone actually, anyone who's, any of you are taking this course right now, what happens when we have these incredibly disaggregated value chains that we've created over the last 20 years that have procurement and production and distribution and all of those kinds of things so distributed all over the world. And now we see a sort of disintegration of the ability to execute these disaggregated value chains, right? And this is a real issue in business. And of course, Michael O'Sullivan doesn't necessarily recommend this as a policy response, but sort of sets it up as kind of a typical response. So then he sort of sets up this kind of dichotomy, which politicians are going to sort of force upon us, particularly as business people, this dichotomy between corporate success and the success of people, which is not necessarily false, right? If we look at the situation now, the battles over the next 10 years are going to be saying, look, corporate profit and stock market prices and valuations and all of those kinds of things have never been so extreme, particularly when you compare it to the less success at the household level. That households have never been so in debt as they are. Wages to GDP have never been so low as they have. And all of these, let's take it back to one of the earlier chapters. All of this was acceptable when the tide was in, when everybody was rising, right? When there was lots of wealth. But as the tide goes out, people are going to be looking at this and say, wow, these are amazing valuations for corporations and incredible profits and hoarding, if you will. But look at me, I've got nothing. I've got all this debt and I can't grow and I can't feed my family, that kind of thing. And so this is sort of the real issue, the real politic that that leaders are going to be facing. And so he sees all of this in a sense as a false choice, because the answer is to get back to productivity. He would argue, right? If we can get back to productivity, if we can understand that productivity is essentially, I'd like to, I may take a break here from this to get you to sort of understand sort of my take on how to think about productivity. Think about productivity as the extraction of energy, right? And so that energy is stored, and if we extract it, we can use it, and that'll make our lives better, right? We can do things with energy. And so productivity is essentially human energy. And so we've essentially extracted all we can extract out of the human person, if you will, in terms of their productivity. And in fact, if you go back to say, now we're looking back in chapters, things like obesity and health issues and all of those kinds of things are holding back our productivity. And so we may no longer be able to grow simply by this sort of artificial debt, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. And we may not be able to grow by simply extracting more energy. There is now, perhaps, I think what he's trying to bring out here is a need for us to refocus our energies around human productivity. And you're not going to do that unless you fundamentally develop the human person, right? Unless you focus on human development, this human development index that you reviewed. That's the only way forward. He's essentially arguing the only sort of successful way forward for societies. So things like ensuring the rule of law is followed, and we have people can access institutions that are healthy, that people have the absolute maximum amount of education, or the optimal amount of education to be productive. And that's what's really quite disturbing right now. I have never in my life seen such attacks all over the place at education. Of course, I'm used to it a little bit, some attacks, right? I mean, I've been in education most of my life, and nobody likes experts, right? It's just the way it is, too much. But nothing like we've seen it before now, sort of a complete dismissal of intelligence, dismissal of science. And that's not good. That's not good for productivity. Healthcare, right? As we say, people are going to need to be substantially concerned with their health if we're going to become more than we are, right? So it's the idea is that you say, well, healthcare has never been as good as it has. True, perhaps. Education is, how we have great access to education. We have institutions, we have rule of law, but we're hitting limits on what we can do with that in terms of our future. We have to go forward, and we're not going to go forward through these other sort of making America great again is kind of his argument, right? We can't go backwards to go forward, that we have to focus on the future economy. Okay, and the next chapter, chapter 7, gets at another one of the hearts of the book. And they say, Michael Sullivan's his PhD, his area of expertise, and his work is in finance. And so his argument here is that we need this kind of Westphalia for finance. That is a new treaty, a complete new agreement on what we're going to do in terms of how finance is going to be run throughout the world. And he takes absolute shot at the work of central bankers. And a really interesting comparison that he stretches through most of this chapter is that what are we going to do when the morphine runs out? And that's the sort of the quote, I think, that holds this chapter together. So what's this problem that he's bringing up, these sort of big financial problems? And his argument is essentially that debt is absolutely out of control. This is not the first time in my life that we've seen this. I lived through the Asia financial crisis in Asia, in Seoul, and it was beyond horrific. It was not unusual every day to read multiple accounts in the news of suicides. People were just jumping out of the windows. It was that bad. Families were absolutely destroyed by the debt crisis. Essentially, it was a debt crisis that brought down Asia. Not household debts, actually. Households were quite surprisingly liquid. It was corporate debt that really fueled the Asia financial crisis. And so I've seen this before, personally. And it absolutely destroyed many corporations. Many of them were rebuilt, but many of them haven't in Korea. But imagine it now, not just isolated to a few countries like South Korea and Thailand and Taiwan, but imagine it now spread across the entire world, and not just at the corporate level, but at government levels and at household debt. And we're swimming in so much debt that world debt has never been this high since the end of the Second World War. And his argument here is that growth and inflation are simply not going to get us out of this mess this time, right? The belief before was that we could just grow, we could just manage the debt, and we'll put it in, we'll get it controlled, and then we'll just grow ourselves out of it, right? And eventually it won't look so bad. And I said this earlier in the lecture, but you could use a different analogy. You could think about, like, if you had a bit of dirt, and you were a small little person, and then you had this dirt, and then as you grew and grew, and you got 8 feet tall, and you look down, there's a tiny little piece of dirt there. That doesn't matter. And this is this idea of outgrowing debt, right? And that's essentially arguing that's over, because it's spread to the entire world, right? And we're seeing huge economies like the United States and China beginning to swim in debt. Maybe China less so at the household level, but certainly Europe, and we're sort of maxed out. And you can't stimulate the economies anymore. This is the Japanese problem. So the Japanese have had near zero, or kind of effectively, particularly when looking at inflation or cost of living, if you will, and other aspects, they've had near zero or negative interest rates over the past several decades, and that has not been enough to stimulate the Japanese economy back to where it was. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing central bankers offering free money, nearly. Insane things. If you've got good enough credit right now, you can go and negotiate yourself this is a household, you can negotiate yourself a collateralized mortgage at like less than 2%, like 1.8, 1.7% interest. Imagine that. Imagine borrowing money in a mortgage for 1.7%. It's true right now. If you can get the debt, and this is an issue, that if we've maxed out our debt, then it doesn't matter how cheap interest rates are. If governments don't have the flexibility, if households are tapped for debt, and if businesses can't do anything with it, right, and can't grow with it, then it doesn't matter what the interest rates are. People are not going to borrow that money. And so that's not going to get us out of the debt crisis this time. And so he sees that as probably our biggest challenge to economic prosperity going forward. It'll be interesting to see how you guys, which not only what you think about it, but what do you think are the solutions, and what do you think of the solutions, not necessarily from the sort of grand political economy perspective that we're learning about, but I do think we should think about that. But what's the business solutions to this, right? How would we solve these problems for our members of our community? And he puts it squarely, and this is really important. He puts it squarely on quantitative easing. And let me tell you, you're not going to get a better explanation of quantitative easing than what's in this book. So if you read the book and you say, I still don't really understand what he means by quantitative easing, read it again. I actually found it quite insightful. I understood what quantitative easing was. I'm not a finance expert, and I had a basic understanding of quantitative easing. But actually, this book really helped. I found it helpful. Like, once again, he puts it in, that sort of Irish way of putting it into story that I thought was quite useful. But essentially, so I'll try to, in the sort of the simplest form, quantitative easing is that the central banks are essentially, shall we say, printing money, creating wealth creating money supply by buying up debt. So they would simply say, well, there are now another, in Canada, I think it's $50 billion the Bank of Canada is going to buy, or some damn number like that. And that the bank will buy up this debt. And essentially, how it buys up the debt is by creating the money out of whole cloth, right? They don't. The central bank is not going anywhere. They're not borrowing money to buy up the debt. They're creating the money to buy up the debt, and so by doing so, they're easing. Right? They're easing, if you will, money supply. They're increasing the amount of monetary supply in the system. It's an interesting technique. What's incredible is that it was only invented, only sort of put into any use 10 or 15 years ago. And now, for the last 8 years, we've seen nothing but more and more of this quantitative easing. And essentially, it has to. And to say, I'm not myself an expert in finance. Maybe if any of you are, it would be really nice if we had a couple of finance majors taking this course with us. They can maybe help us out even more. But for me, I don't understand how you can dilute your money supply without end. And I think Michael Sullivan's making the argument that you can't, and that we can't just continue on with this. Currencies would cease to become of any value if we just eliminate the debt by creating money. So I think that's really, and he says this is over. And so what he's saying is that it's time to stop the morphine. This is what the quantitative easing is what he's calling the morphine, right? That central bankers, through the purchase of debt and other forms of quantitative easing and and interest rate lowering and all of these crazy things that they're doing in the financial markets, are a kind of morphine. And morphine is really, really good for dulling the pain. When I broke my ankle terribly, they gave me this morphine, and it felt really good until it went away, and then I was in pain again, right? And so I said, well, I don't know if I take this morphine anymore, because it doesn't help me. And so, but you get addicted to it, and you need more and more and more and more and more of it. I think morphine is a wonderful example here, because not only does it not fix the pain, but just simply dull the pain, and in fact maybe make the underlying problem worse, but that you need more and more and more and more of it in order to sustain your habit, and it's addictive. And it's the day when it comes, when the doctors say, or they send you to the psychologist or the psychiatrist and say, that's it, you're done, you can't have any more morphine. It's hard to come off of it. And I think it's a really powerful example. So I really spend some time on chapter 7 here, really understanding what he's saying, and why he thinks this is a major issue for us in the development of our economies.